On my birthday, my son sent me a bottle of wine as a gift. At first, I thought it was a gesture of love, but then my wife glanced at it, went pale, and whispered, "Don't touch it." I frowned and asked, "Why? What can't you see?" I leaned closer, and the truth froze me in place. 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. My birthday should have been a quiet evening. Nothing more than a table set for one, a flickering candle I lit myself, and the hollow silence of a house that used to overflow with laughter. I didn't expect gifts. I didn't expect calls. After 70 years of life and too many losses to count, I've trained myself not to. But when the doorbell rang that night and I saw the delivery man standing there with a slim, ribbon-tied box, my chest betrayed me. Hope slipped in like an unwelcome guest. The card said it was from my son, my only son, the same one who hadn't looked me in the eye the last time we spoke. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon, my breath heavy with the weight of years I spent raising him. Inside was a single bottle of wine, foreign and expensive, with a note in his wife's handwriting more than his. "Happy birthday. Enjoy it with friends." Friends. As if she didn't know this house hadn't held a dinner guest in months. I stared at the glass, the way it caught the dim kitchen light. It wasn't the gift itself that stung. It was the emptiness of it, the impersonality. He knew I didn't drink wine anymore, not since the doctor's warnings after the surgery. He knew it would sit unopened like the dozens of memories I've shelved in this house. It wasn't a gift. It was a reminder. A reminder that I was no longer seen, no longer known. When I called to thank him, his voice was distant, hurried, as though he were in another world entirely. "Oh yeah, glad it got there, Dad. Listen, I can't talk. I'll check in later." He didn't, and I knew he wouldn't. That night, I left the wine on the table and went to bed with the weight of a realization pressing on my chest heavier than any illness could. I had become an obligation, not a father. A signature on a card, a scheduled call, a burden wrapped in ribbons. 2 days later, his father-in-law came by. A tall man, broad-shouldered still despite his years, always with that smug air of ownership, as though my son marrying his daughter had handed him dominion over everything I'd built. He sat in my living room without asking, legs stretched, voice booming. He looked at the wine bottle on the table and chuckled. "Fine taste they've got, don't they?" he said, running his fingers along the glass. "They sent it to me," I replied quietly. He smirked. "Well, you don't drink, do you? Shame to waste it." His words were sharp, but his tone was casual, mocking even, like he'd walked in not to visit, but to claim something that was never his. I stared at him, then at the bottle. The truth settled heavy in me. The gift wasn't for me, it was for him. I was just the courier. So I slid the bottle across the table. He raised his eyebrows but didn't protest. He took it as if it had always been meant for him. Something broke in me then, though I didn't let it show. It wasn't about the wine. It was about watching my son's loyalty, my son's respect, my son's love, poured into the glass of another man. A man who had given him nothing but a last name by marriage, while I had given him everything. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't beg him to stay and drink it with me. I just stood, walked to the kitchen, and washed my hands under cold water as if I could rinse the betrayal off my skin. When I came back, he was gone. The bottle, too. Only silence remained. And in that silence, for the first time in my life, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel toward my own flesh and blood. A quiet, dangerous anger. I didn't shout. I didn't call my son to demand answers. I didn't drive across town to knock on his door. Instead, I sat in my chair by the window, watching the streetlight flicker, and I made a promise to myself. Not one spoken aloud. Not even whispered. Just a vow etched in my chest. If they thought I was weak, if they thought I was finished, if they thought I would fade into silence and die quietly while they feasted on the fruits of my labor, they were wrong. Because I built this life with my bare hands. I built this home, these accounts, this legacy. And if they wanted to forget that, then I would remind them. Not with rage, not with noise, but with the kind of silence that turns into strategy. I stood, turned off the light, and walked to bed. My footsteps echoed in the empty house, louder than words, louder than tears. They thought I was grieving. They thought I was old. They thought I was harmless. They forgot. I was trained for this. I woke the next morning and let my eyes wander across the ceiling. tracing the faint cracks in the plaster like old rivers. They weren't flaws to me. They were history. Each one told a story. Each line a reminder of time passing in the house I had built with my own hands, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck. This home wasn't just wood and mortar. It was a monument, a diary written in nails and sweat. When I first laid the foundation, I was young, strong, and certain of the world. I remember pouring cement with calloused hands, my back aching under the summer sun, while neighbors stood at the fence lines shaking their heads. "You're too ambitious," they said. "Too big a house for a man like you." But I had a vision, not of grandeur, not of status, but of laughter echoing through hallways, children running barefoot across polished floors, a kitchen that would always smell like bread. I built not for myself, but for the family I dreamed of. And for a time, that dream was alive. The dining table in the corner still carries faint knife marks from the years my son tried carving his initials into its edge, thinking I wouldn't notice. I never sanded them out. Every time I ran my hand across that wood, I remembered the sound of his giggles as I caught him in the act, the way his mother pretended to scold him but couldn't hide her smile. The walls still hold shadows of framed pictures I once hung, school portraits with uneven ties, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor, birthdays where the cake leaned to one side because I had baked it myself when his mother was too tired. I kept those pictures even when the colors faded, even when the smiles turned into echoes of something I no longer saw in real life. The staircase groans in the same places it always did. I used to know which step to avoid late at night when carrying my sleeping son from the car to his bed, his head nestled into my shoulder, his tiny hand gripping my shirt. That groan was a warning back then. Now it's a companion, the only sound that breaks the silence when I move through the house alone. I think often of the sacrifices etched into these walls, how many hours of overtime I worked so we could replace the roof when the storms tore through one spring. How I skipped meals during lean, months to keep the mortgage paid. How I sold my tools, the ones my father left me, just to buy my son the guitar he swore he needed for school. I told myself it was worth it, that this house wasn't just shelter, it was a promise. No matter how hard the world became, they would always have a place where love stood guard at the door. There was a night, long ago, when the heater broke in the middle of winter. My son was no more than 6, his mother was wrapped in blankets, shivering, and I sat on the floor all night with the oven door open, feeding wood into it to keep the kitchen warm. I remember the way he crawled into my lap, his hair smelling faintly of smoke and shampoo, whispering, "Daddy, you're my hero." That whisper built me stronger than any brick. But now, that same kitchen is cold, the oven door closed, the air heavy with dust instead of warmth. The couch where we once piled together for Sunday movies sits stiff, the fabric worn but untouched. I sit there alone sometimes, not watching anything, just remembering the weight of their bodies leaning against mine, how the rhythm of breathing together was enough to make the world feel safe. Even the garden outside tells its story. Rows of roses his mother planted still bloom, though wild now, thorns thicker, petals more fragile. I trimmed them once with care, because she loved how they caught the morning light. After she passed, I trimmed them out of duty because I wanted to keep her memory alive. Now, I let them grow as they wish, untamed, like grief. I see them through the window every morning, and I wonder if he remembers that those roses were watered with her laughter. I built this house as a sanctuary. Every corner has my fingerprints pressed into it. The walls know my prayers. The roof remembers my curses. The floors have absorbed my sweat. And yet, to my son and his wife, it has become invisible. They walk through it as if it were just another structure, as if its worth is measured only in market value, in square footage, in its ability to impress their friends at dinner parties. They don't see the sacrifices carved into its bones. When they visit now, which is rare, they move quickly through the rooms, eyes fixed on their phones, voice pass, as discussing renovations they'll never make. It's old, they say. It needs modernizing. They don't see that age is the very thing that makes it sacred. They don't hear the echoes of every argument that turned into reconciliation, every storm that passed while we huddled inside, every milestone celebrated under this roof. Once I overheard my son telling his wife, "One day, this place will be ours, we'll make it our own." He said it as if I were already gone, as if my body were just a shadow lingering too long. The words cut deeper than any insult because they stripped the house of its soul and turned it into property. My life's greatest creation reduced to an inheritance waiting to be claimed. Sometimes, when I sit by the fireplace, I close my eyes and imagine it as it was, the crackling logs, her voice singing softly in the kitchen, his laughter chasing the dog down the hall. I see the light flickering against faces I loved, alive and warm. I feel the weight of belonging, and then I open my eyes, and the flames are gone. The hearth is cold, the silence presses down, heavier than the years. It used to be filled with love. Now it echoed with silence. Money, they say, is just paper. But when I look back, I see that every bill I earned, every dollar I spent, carried something heavier than ink. It carried the weight of my love. And I gave it away freely, never once keeping score, because I believed that fathers weren't supposed to. I remember the first tuition bill that arrived in the mail. The envelope was thick, the numbers obscene. I sat at the kitchen table that night long after everyone had gone to bed, the only light the weak glow of the overhead bulb. My hands trembled as I did the math, realizing I didn't have enough. But when I walked past his bedroom door and heard him murmuring in his sleep about going to college, making us proud, I knew there was no decision to make. I took a second job the next morning. For 4 years, I left before sunrise and returned after dark. I worked shifts at the bank, then shifts loading trucks, the kind of labor I hadn't done in decades. My back ached, my hands cracked, but each check meant another semester paid. I used to slip the receipts into a folder I kept in the drawer: tuition, books, housing, thousands upon thousands of dollars, piled up like bricks of sacrifice. He never saw that folder, and maybe that was my mistake. I thought love didn't need proof. The day he graduated, he ran to me in his cap and gown, threw his arms around me, and whispered, "We'll always be there for you, Dad." My throat closed. In that moment, the years of exhaustion, the late nights, the skipped meals, all of it felt worth it. That hug repaid me in ways money never could, or so I thought. Then came the wedding. His bride wanted grandeur, a hall glittering with chandeliers, tables dressed in silk, food that cost more than my first car. I sat across from him one evening, gently suggesting a simpler ceremony, something small, intimate, affordable. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet my eyes. "Dad, she deserves the wedding of her dreams." So I signed the checks. I sold my old car. I drained the savings his mother and I had planned to use for travel in our retirement. I did it with a smile because I wanted him to stand tall, to begin his new life with dignity. I remember walking her down the aisle halfway, since her father insisted on the other half, his grip on her arm firm as if she belonged solely to him. And when the vows ended, when the cheers erupted, my son sought me out in the crowd. He mouthed, "Thank you." That single glance felt like a crown placed on my head. I didn't know then how quickly it would be taken away. After the wedding came the house. They wanted space, something bigger than their small apartment. "Just until we're on our feet," he said. I co-signed the mortgage papers, my signature scrawled in blue ink beside his. I remember holding the pen too long, my hand frozen, because some voice inside me whispered that this was dangerous, but I silenced it. He was my son. How could I refuse him the foundation I had once dreamed of for myself? After that night, after hearing the words that stripped me bare, "You need to leave," I stopped sleeping properly. I would lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house groan with age, my mind replaying the past like a courtroom cross-examination. I kept asking myself how I could have given so much and still ended up cast out like refuse. But as the days passed, my sorrow hardened into something sharper. Grief became suspicion. One morning, I drove to the bank, the same bank where I had once worked in my youth, back when my hair was still black and my back unbroken. The teller who greeted me was young enough to be my grandson, his face smooth, his voice cheerful in the way only the inexperienced can manage. I slid my identification across the counter and asked for a full review of my accounts. His smile faltered as he clicked through his screen, and the longer he typed, the tighter the silence grew. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to wait a moment." He disappeared into a back office, and when he returned, it was with the manager, a man in his 40s with the kind of careful eyes bankers wear when they know they're about to deliver bad news. He invited me into a small glass office, closed the door, and laid out the papers. There it was, page after page of obligations tied to my name, mortgages, loans, credit extensions, some I recognized, the ones I had co-signed, the safety nets I had provided, but others were strangers to me, amounts so large they looked like telephone numbers. I felt the blood drain from my face as I traced the signatures. My son's handwriting, messy and rushed, scrawled across documents that bound me as tightly as chains, my name stamped alongside his. How is this possible? My voice was barely a whisper. The manager folded his hands. Mr. Williams, when you co-sign, you share responsibility. If your son defaults, the liabilitat returns to you. And unfortunately, many of these accounts are severely overdue. I couldn't breathe. I asked for more papers, more records. I wanted to see it all, and the truth came spilling out like rot from a cracked foundation. Credit cards maxed out, loans unpaid, mortgages in default, quiet bankruptcies filed under their names, dragging my credit down with them like an anchor. They had borrowed and borrowed, building their world on the illusion of stability I provided, and when it collapsed, the rubble fell on me. I drove straight from the bank to my lawyer's office, the same man who had handled my wife's will years before. He looked older now, his glasses thicker, but his memory was sharp. I laid the stack of papers on his desk and told him everything. He skimmed, frowned, leaned back in his chair. "They've used your trust against you," he said finally. "Every co-signature, every guarantee, it's all binding. You're still responsible, legally, financially, even if you never touched a cent." I sat in silence, the weight of it pressing into my bones. For years, I had told myself my sacrifices were investments in love, but love had turned into liability, and liability had turned into ruin. I wasn't just abandoned by my son, I was shackled to his mistakes. The lawyer watched me closely. "You have options," he said, "but you need to stop thinking like a father and start thinking like a man protecting himself. They've left you exposed. If you don't act, they'll drag you under with them." His words sliced through me. For so long, I had defined myself by fatherhood, by sacrifice, by the belief that giving was my duty. But in that office, staring at contracts inked with betrayal, I realized I had been nothing more than a safety net to them, and they had cut me loose the moment it no longer served their climb. I left the office and drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they shook. The streets blurred past, but all I could see were the years of lies I'd mistaken for gratitude. I remembered my son's promises. "We'll always be there for you, Dad," and felt the sting of how easily he had rewritten those words into debts, into obligations, into shackles. When I arrived at the house, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the yard, staring at the bricks I had laid decades ago. I thought of the foundation, how I had dug it with my own hands, sweating under the sun, determined to build something that would outlast me. And it had. The house still stood, but the family inside had crumbled. I walked into my study, opened the drawer where I kept the old folder of receipts, and spread them across the desk. Tuition, weddings, down payments, every sacrifice laid out in ink. Then I placed the new papers beside them, the debts, the defaults, the betrayals. Old promises on one side, broken realities on the other. And as I stared at the contrast, the truth settled deep in me like a final verdict. They hadn't just abandoned me emotionally, they had tethered me to their failures, used my trust as collateral, and built their fragile empire on the back of my silence. And all this time, I had thought I was giving them love. In reality, I had been feeding a beast that would one day turn on me. But grief has a strange way of sharpening memory. Sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of betrayal, I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. My first job at the bank, the lessons my old manager taught me, how to read between the lines of contracts, how to find the weaknesses others overlooked, how to see not just numbers but strategies. They thought I had grown old and harmless. They thought grief had dulled my edges. But as I sat there, a quiet fire burned inside me, brighter than anger, colder than rage. They thought I was grieving. They forgot I was trained for this. The thing about age is people mistake it for weakness. They see the white hair, the slower step, the quiet manner, and they assume you've softened. They don't realize that silence can be sharper than shouting, that time doesn't just wear a man down, it hardens him into something unbreakable. When I walked back into the bank the next week, I didn't enter as a father desperate for answers. I entered as the man I used to be, the banker who could dismantle a balance sheet with a glance, the strategist who knew how to trace a lie through numbers like blood through veins. I started with records, every loan, every mortgage, every debt tied to my name. I demanded copies, full histories, not just the summaries they try to placate you with. When the young manager hesitated, I leaned in and told him quietly, "This is my name on these documents. Don't confuse politeness with passivity." He didn't hesitate again. I spent nights at my desk, surrounded by paper, highlighters bleeding across columns of numbers, old instincts returning like muscle memory. Each page told a story, hidden transfers, late fees covered by temporary advances, accounts opened under the guise of family trusts but drained within months. Patterns emerged, lies exposed themselves in the details. My son hadn't just been careless, he had been deliberate, weaving my name into his safety nets, gambling recklessly because he believed I would always absorb the fall. But if fatherhood had blinded me, the banker in me was awake again now, and he saw everything. I called in favors, old colleagues, retired now, but not out of reach. Men and women who still owed me for recommendations I once wrote, for advice I once gave. One was a lawyer specializing in contract law, another a forensic accountant. They agreed to meet, not out of charity, but respect. Respect for the man I used to be, the man I had allowed to rust under years of sacrifice. Over coffee in a quiet diner, the lawyer slid his glasses down and studied the stack of documents I carried like a weapon. He whistled low. "They've been sloppy," he said. "But sloppy works in your favor. Fraud disguised as oversight, debts hidden under trusts that aren't legally sound, signatures that don't hold up under scrutiny. If you want to pursue this, you've got them cornered." The accountant added his own notes. He highlighted accounts with red ink, circled names of shell businesses that existed only on paper. They've tried to move money through rough entities that don't even have proper registration. It's amateur work. If you file the right reports, you won't just protect yourself. You'll bury them. I nodded, absorbing every word. This wasn't about vengeance, not yet. This was about clarity, about proving, to myself more than anyone else, that I wasn't powerless, that I could still wield the tools they thought I had forgotten. Back home, I built files, stacks of them, labeled, organized, meticulous, one for each loan, one for each mortgage, one for each manipulation. I drafted timelines, cross-referenced signatures, aligned dates with transactions. My desk became a battlefield, and I was the general again, drawing maps of a war they didn't even know had begun. The deeper I dug, the colder I became. I no longer thought of my son as the boy I carried on my shoulders or the young man I hugged at graduation. He was a debtor now, a client in default, a liability to be managed. And his wife, the one who had smiled sweetly while asking for checks, the one who had whispered in his ear to distance himself from me, she was no daughter-in-law. She was a co-conspirator. Together they had turned me into collateral. Together, they would face the reckoning. I remembered something my old manager once told me when I was a young clerk, hungry to rise. Banking isn't about money. It's about leverage. Control the leverage, and you control the outcome. Back then, I thought he was only speaking of ledgers and accounts. Now, I understood. Leverage wasn't just financial. It was emotional, psychological, familial. And they had forgotten I was the man who learned to wield it before they were even born. Once the files were complete, I began ordering reports, credit histories, property assessments, bankruptcy filings. Quietly, carefully, I pieced together the empire they had tried to build, and I found its foundation rotted through. They were drowning, and every attempt they made to rise pulled me deeper, but I was no longer treading water, I was building a raft. One night, as I sat surrounded by papers, the house silent except for the ticking clock, I caught myself smiling. Not the smile of joy, but the thin, sharp smile of a man who has found his footing after being pushed into a pit. I realized then that I was no longer grieving in the way they assumed. Grief had sharpened into purpose. Betrayal had become blueprint. I thought back to the moment his father-in-law had taken that wine bottle from my table, smirking as though it had always belonged to him. The arrogance, the entitlement, I realized he was just as culpable, maybe more. His influence over them had steered the ship into ruin. Fine. Then he, too, would taste the consequences of the world he helped build. I prepared letters, drafted notices. I didn't send them yet. No, this was a long game. The kind of game I had played before, when one wrong number could collapse a deal or one well-placed clause could save it. And as I worked, I felt younger, sharper, as though time itself had rewound to the days when my mind was a weapon no one dared underestimate. This wasn't noise. This wasn't rage. This was calculation. Every step measured, every move designed to corner them further. And I knew, as I placed the final document into its file and closed the drawer with a deliberate click, that the outcome was inevitable. They thought they were playing chess with an old man fumbling at the board. They forgot I was the one who invented it. You don't play chess with someone who invented the board. The beauty of silence is the srar. at it works like a shadow. You don't notice it creeping until it covers everything. I had laid my groundwork. The files, the reports, the evidence of their recklessness sat neatly in my study, waiting for the day I would need them. But I didn't rush. Revenge isn't a storm. It's a season. And so I sat back, as I had learned to do in boardrooms and negotiations long ago, and I waited for the cracks to show. They appeared sooner than I expected. The first came in the form of a letter. I knew it before I opened it. The envelope was thin, the typeface printed by some overworked clerk, but I had seen thousands like it in my career. A rejection. When I read it, I almost laughed. My son had applied for another loan, likely to prop up the sagging business he had started with his father-in-law. Denied. Credit history unsatisfactory. The words were sharp, impersonal, final. I held the paper for a long time, then slipped it into one of my folders. One more nail in a coffin they had built themselves. Soon, I began to notice the subtle unraveling of their lives. Driving past their house one evening, I saw the car in the driveway, hood up, his wife standing with her arms crossed while he bent under it, his voice raised in frustration. Later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that the repairs had drained what little savings they had left. Another time, I spotted her at the grocery store. Credit card declined, cheeks flushed red as she fumbled for cash. I walked past without acknowledgement. The silence between us was louder than words. Then came the business troubles. Their family venture, the one they had boasted about at dinners, was quietly crumbling. Suppliers unpaid, clients lost, reputation tarnished. I heard whispers through the same community that once envied them. Overextended, they said, living beyond their means. I never added to the gossip, but I didn't need to. Failure announces itself. I sat in the corner of a cafe one morning, sipping black coffee as they walked in together. I doubt they saw me. Their voices were low but sharp, slicing each other with blame. "You promised me it would work," she hissed. "If your father had helped more." His response was bitter, defensive. They tore at each other like dogs over scraps, forgetting they were in public, forgetting how carefully they once curated their image. I watched, unblinking. Not with joy, not with pity, but with the calm of a man observing the predictable outcome of a flawed equation. More letters arrived, some delivered to me by mistake, others shown to me by neighbors who still respected me. Overdue notices, collections, foreclosure threats. Each one was a chorus singing the same refrain, collapse. I tucked them into my files page by page as though building an archive of their downfall. The day the foreclosure notice came for their house, I stood on my porch and watched the mailman pee their steps across the street. I couldn't see inside, but I imagined the scene. The wife's sharp intake of breath, my son's face turning pale as he unfolded the paper. I wondered if he thought of me then, if he remembered my steady hand signing those mortgage papers all those years ago, if he realized the very safety net he had relied on had become a noose tightening around his own neck. They argued more often now, loudly, their voices carried through open windows in the summer air, accusations spilling like poison. "You've ruined us," she would scream. "If your father had any decency—" And then his voice cracking under the weight of blame. "Don't bring him into this. He's done enough." I would sit by my window at night, the house dim, listening to the fragments of their collapse. Each word a splinter in their marriage, each fight a fracture that widened with time. And I thought of all the nights I had spent awake worrying for them, praying for their success, sacrificing my own peace so they might have comfort. Now, I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not bitterness, only the steady calm of inevitability. Their father-in-law wasn't spared either. His business, once bloated with arrogance, began to shrink. I saw his trucks sitting idle, weeds growing around their tires. He came to my house one afternoon, his swagger dimmed, his tone quieter. "Have you heard from them?" he asked. I shook my head. He didn't linger. The man who once took wine from my table now walked away with empty hands. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was gradual, like a subtle leak draining a reservoir. But that was its cruelty, watching them scramble, watching them patch one hole only for another to burst. I never interfered. I never offered advice or aid. I simply watched, the same way one watches the tide retreat, knowing the ocean will not return in time to save what's stranded on the shore. There's a certain poetry in destruction when you've been patient enough to witness it. I thought of the years I was rain for them, steady, nourishing, constant. Every time they faltered, I poured into their lives, kept them alive, made them bloom. And now, withholding that rain, I saw what they truly were. fragile, dependent, unprepared for drought. I sat in my garden one evening, the roses overgrown, their thorns sharper than ever. The sun sank low, casting long shadows over the yard. From across the street I heard shouting again, doors slamming, glass breaking, my son's voice carried out into the air, desperate and hoarse, but I did not rise. I trimmed a rose instead, its petal falling softly into my hand. They thought I was the rain, I was the drought. It happened on a Sunday evening, when the air was still and heavy, the kind of silence that makes every sound ring sharper. I was sitting in my chair by the window when I saw their car crawl into the driveway, headlights dim, paint dulled by neglect. For a moment, I thought they might just sit there and turn back, but eventually the door opened. My son stepped out. At first, shoulders slumped, his wife trailing behind, her eyes darting nervously toward the house. They knocked, tentative at first, then louder. I opened the door without a word. They looked older somehow, worn down, the kind of wear you can't hide with makeup or cologne. "Dad," my son said, his voice low, cracked. Can we talk?" I stepped aside. They entered as if stepping into a church, reverent but desperate. The house seemed to notice, the air shifting with their presence. They sat on the edge of the couch, hands clenched together, waiting for me to speak. I didn't. Finally, his wife broke the silence. "We're in trouble," she said. "Everything's falling apart. The bank, the house," her voice caught. "We didn't know who else to turn to." I remained still, my gaze steady. My son leaned forward, his eyes wet. "Dad, please. You've always helped us. Always. Remember when I was in college, how you worked yourself sick just to make sure I could graduate? You said you'd never let me fail. Please, don't let me fail, now." The memories he conjured rose like ghosts, nights I skipped meals, days I worked 2 jobs. But they didn't soften me. They sharpened me. His wife pressed in. "Think of the children we wanted to give you, the family you said you dreamed of. We can still have that if we can just get through this. Your wife, God rest her soul, she'd never want to see us like this. She'd want you to help." At the mention of her, my chest tightened. My wife, who had given her life to this family, who had whispered faith into my ear when I doubted myself. They used her memory like currency, trading it for pity. It was not love. It was manipulation dressed in mourning clothes. Tears spilled down my son's cheeks. He buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know we said things we shouldn't have. I know we pushed you away, but please, we need you. Just this once more. Help us. Save us. You're all we have." I watched them crumble, the weight of their failures pressing down like stones. I listened to every word, every plea, every desperate invocation of the past, but I gave them nothing in return. Not anger, not forgiveness, not comfort, only silence. The quiet grew unbearable. My son's sobs filled the room, his wife clutching his arm as though she could anchor him to dignity. Still, I sat unmoved. Finally, he looked up at me, eyes red, his voice hollow. "Say something," he whispered. I did not, because there was nothing left to say. They searched my face for mercy, for the father who had once sacrificed everything. But that man was gone. What sat before them now was not their safety net, not their savior, not their parent. It was something colder, harder, truer. I rose slowly, my steps deliberate, and walked to the desk where my files waited. I let my hand rest on the drawer, though I did not open it. Then I turned back to them, my voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through their despair. I wasn't their family anymore. I was their creditor. They came again, a week later. Not frantic this time, but hollow, like soldiers already defeated before the battle began. I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. They followed me into the living room, their footsteps hesitant, the air heavy with things unsaid. I gestured to the table. It was already prepared, not with food, not with drink, but with files. Stacks of folders, each neatly labeled, arranged like evidence in a courtroom. My son glanced at them and froze. His wife shifted uneasily. I sat down first. They followed, perching on the edge of the couch like children awaiting punishment. Still, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply opened the first folder and slid it across the table. "This," I said evenly, "is the mortgage you asked me to co-sign. See the dates, see the payments missed, see the foreclosure notice." He swallowed hard, his eyes scanning the pages, his fingers trembling. I opened another file. "And this, the loans, business accounts, shell companies you registered but never maintained. Fraud, whether you meant it or not. His wife reached out as if to stop me. "Dad, please." I raised my hand gently, silencing her. Then I opened another folder. Credit cards, cars, personal loans, everyone tied to my name, everyone in default, everyone dragging me down with you. The room was silent except for the shuffle of papers. Their faces paled with each page, realization dawning like a storm they couldn't outrun. My son pressed his palms against his eyes as if he could block out the truth. His wife whispered, "How did you—" "I was a banker," I said quietly. "I built careers reading numbers, finding patterns, exposing lies. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I had forgotten?" I leaned back, calm, steady. "You thought my grief would blind me. You thought age made me ache. You thought I would keep paying, keep sacrificing, until there was nothing left." I tapped the stack of files with a single finger, but I don't bleed blindly anymore. I keep records. And now, so do you. My son's voice cracked. "Dad, we never meant—" I cut him off with silence, letting his unfinished words hang like smoke in the air. Then I spread the folders wider, timelines marked, signatures highlighted, just debts circled in red. It wasn't rage that filled the room. It was precision. They were watching the slow, deliberate architecture of their undoing. His wife clutched his arm. "This is revenge," she whispered. "No," I said. "This is balance. For years, I carried you. Now, I set you down." The weight of the moment pressed on them. They looked smaller than I'd ever seen, two figures crumbling under the quiet force of truth. The power had shifted. It wasn't mine to seize, it was theirs to lose, and they had lost it long before they stepped through my door. I closed the final folder with a soft click. The sound rang louder than any shout. Then I looked at them. My son, once the center of my sacrifices, now a debtor in every sense of the word. "Let's talk terms." The silence after my words lingered like a verdict. They sat frozen, eyes darting between the folders spread across the table. My son's face was pale, his wife's lips pressed tight. They knew the game was no longer theirs. "You want my help," I said, my voice calm, measured. "Then you'll have it, but not without terms." His wife leaned forward quickly, almost desperate. "Anything, just tell us what to do." My eyes fixed on her, steady as stone. "First, a public apology, not whispered to me in private, not buried behind excuses. You will stand before the family, the neighbors you've deceived, and admit what you've done. You will say the words, that you used me, that you buried me in your debts, that you treated love as collateral. Only then will the first door open." Her mouth fell open. "That's humiliating." I nodded once. "It's honest." My son shifted, his voice breaking. "Dad, please, don't make us do that. Think of how it'll look." "It will look," I interrupted, "exactly as it should. Truth often does." I opened another folder and slid it toward them. Inside were contracts I had drafted with the lawyer who owed me favors. Second, legal agreements. You will not sign another loan, another mortgage, another credit card, without my approval. You will live within your means, or you will live with nothing. His hands shook as he flipped through the pages. This makes you our guardian." "No," I said evenly. "It makes me your warden." His wife bristled, her pride sparking through her fear. "We're not children." "Then stop behaving like them," I replied. I tapped the third folder. Therapy, financial counseling, weekly sessions until a professional, not me, certifies you've learned discipline. You've wasted years running from responsibility. Now you'll face it. And you'll pay for those sessions out of your own pockets, not mine. My son's head dropped into his hands. His wife shook hers in disbelief. "You're stripping us of everything. Dignity, freedom, control." I leaned back, folding my arms. "No, I'm offering you survival. I could let you drown. Instead, I'm throwing you a rope, with knots that cut if you try to wriggle free. Mercy isn't comfort. Mercy is correction." They sat in silence, broken by small, trembling breaths. Finally, my son whispered, "And if we refuse?" I spread my hand across the folders, a quiet gesture to the evidence, the timelines, the leverage. Then I walk away. The banks will finish what I started. The courts will take the rest. Refuse, and you will lose everything. His wife tried one last surge of defiance. "You can't control us forever." My eyes locked onto hers. "Long enough," I said. The weight of inevitability pressed them down. resistance drained, pride cracked. Slowly, my son reached for the pen, his hand trembling as he signed the first contract. His wife hesitated, then followed, her signature stiff with anger. Each stroke of ink sounded like chains tightening around their wrists. When the papers were signed, I reached into the drawer and pulled out a single check. Not large enough to save them entirely, but enough to steady the ground under their collapsing feet. I held it between my fingers, not passing it over yet, making them see the distance. "This isn't forgiveness," I said quietly. "This is a transaction. You wanted my mercy, now you've purchased it." I let the silence stretch, let the truth sink into them like cold water. Then, slowly, deliberately, I placed the check on the table between us. Mercy isn't free. The house was quiet again. Not the hollow, aching quiet of abandonment, but a stillness that felt earned, like the last note of a long, painful symphony, finally allowed to fade. I sat in my chair by the window, the same place I had watched them unravel, the same place I had once prayed for them to succeed. The papers were gone now, locked away, the confrontation finished, their signatures binding them more tightly than blood ever had. I breathed deeply, letting the silence wash over me. For years, this home had been a battlefield of sacrifice. Walls soaked with unspoken worries, floors worn down by restless pacing, rooms echoing with the laughter of a boy who no longer existed. Now, it was only mine again. For the first time in decades, I felt no fear of losing it, no fear of being pushed out. They might resent me, they might curse me, but they could not move without my permission, and that was enough. On the mantel sat a photograph of my wife. She was younger in it, caught mid-laugh, her eyes bright with the joy she carried into every room. I reached for it, tracing the edge of the frame with my thumb. For so long I had wondered what she would think of me now. Would she say I had been too harsh? Or would she see, as I now did, that love without boundaries is just another word for self-destruction? I whispered to her in the quiet room, not expecting an answer. I kept the promise, love. I kept the home. I kept myself. The words steadied me, as if her hand still rested gently against mine. Outside, the garden stretched wild, roses blooming untamed. I rose and walked to them, pruning shears in hand. The thorns snagged at my fingers, drawing small lines of red, but I didn't flinch. The air was thick with the scent of petals, sweet and sharp, like memory itself. I cut a single rose and brought it back inside, laying it at the base of her photograph. The house seemed to exhale with me, as though it too felt lighter. I sat again, the rose glowing softly in the lamplight, and allowed myself a rare kind of peace. Not the fragile peace of pretending, but the sturdy peace of truth finally enforced. I thought of them, my son, his wife, the arrogance that had withered into dependence. They had once believed they held all the power. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, my patience for surrender. Now they understood. They could not take a step without remembering the terms. They could not breathe without feeling the weight of my hand on the scales. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of my wife's laughter fill the silence, letting the garden's perfume linger in the room, letting the house wrap itself around me like an old friend. The ache in my chest was gone. The bitterness had drained away. What remained was something colder, cleaner, sharper. They wanted me gone. Now, they can't move without me. Kindness is not weakness, it's patience, weaponized. Justice wore the scent of roses this year.